Jorden Van Foreest, 21-year-old Grandmaster, beat Anish Giri in this final Armageddon game to become the first Dutch champion of Tata Steel Chess in 36 years. So, let me analyze this game for you. It starts out with Anish Giri playing his signature one-in system. Starts with bishop f4, e3, just active piece play first, not playing c3. And so Jorden Van Foreest decides to go with the c5 break. So immediately activity on this pawn. And now he could possibly take and then have both the center pawns, but he decides to go with pawn placement instead. So he plays this, not getting the bishop out, but decides to go with a little bit more of a solid approach. Then now Giri plays c3. And now both players are developing their bishops. You can see here he has this good pin, and then here he's offering a trade. So now Van Foreest decides to go with kind of a little bit more of a pass move. He decides to kind of shy away from the bishop trade and go a little bit more like the solid approach, because this bishop diagonal may not seem good at first, but later in the game it ends up becoming a really important part. So Giri going with the outpost on e5, a very important part of the London. And then Van Foreest goes with this very good and aggressive move, queen b6. This move has multiple purposes. It attacks the bishop on b5, and it also, if the bishop moves, he can capture b2, which also weakens c3, and this very good pawn chain that he has in the center. So, instead of running and allowing him to capture this pawn, Giri decides to defend it, and keeping it here, but then Van Foreest just castles, and after castles, attacks it again. So now the bishop is forced to move, and if he moves, then the queen can take. However, he forces Van Foreest to have to capture back, and then he can defend it on the next move. So he decides to go with d takes c5, which does get the bishop out, but then it allows a very good b4 break, which you can see later in the game. You're going to see that these pawns provide a very important role for Giri to get a winning position. So after bishop back, he goes with a5, which does weaken some of the white squares, but it attacks the queen and gets a little bit more of a tempo. So as you can see, Giri is definitely all about controlling the dark squares. You can see all these pieces are on dark squares, and look at all these pawns here. And he's definitely looking toward these squares to defend and maybe outpost for the knights in the future. So yeah, a reroute, maybe looking at knight c5. And you can see that this diagonal, it's still not doing a lot, but it's stopping the bishop from coming here, and it's stopping the queen and rook from coming here and here. So knight here, they're both looking towards c5. And then now gets the queen a little bit more active and also defending the c5 square, looking at that break in the future. So he decides to go with knight d4, attacking the queen, and then just queen back to b7. So now this does block the bishop in, but the bishop will become active later in the game. So now he decides to go with maybe looking at c4, then b5 in the future if he can get that c5 break, and definitely getting the rook more active. So now Van Foreest attacks this e4 outpost, going toward both this pawn and a bishop trade, as this bishop is quite good. So Anish Giri just kind of ignores this. He's like, all right, well, if you're going to attack me, I'm going to attack you first. So then he decides to allow this trade, which then opens this up. So even though these pawns are doubled and isolated, they're actually still good pawns, because outpost here, and you can also maybe even attack this after playing rook b6, which he does in the future. So yes, he does do rook b6, attacking this. And then, so Giri's like, well, you know what? I'm going to take this pawn. I don't care about this pawn. This pawn's doubled. And then so he allows Van Foreest to go after this pawn. And then he also gets a tempo, getting ready to play rook b1. So the knight is to come back. He offers a trade, but then Giri's like, no, I want you to take my knight and then give me better pawns. So then they kind of just wait here for a while, and then he plays this. So this is actually quite a daring move, because even though this, he gets to reroute back to c4, then white has this e4 move, which is very good. So then instead of that, white actually decides to counterattack the queen, which actually ends up losing a pawn after takes, and then after takes, then it gets the free pawn. Then Van Foreest gets the free pawn. So even though there are opposite colored bishops, Jorden Van Foreest, he does have maybe a little bit more of a passive position, but he does have this extra pawn, which this pawn chain is also good, and you can see this pawn's isolated and prone to attack. So Anish has a little bit more active pieces, but Jorden Van Foreest has the pawn. So then now you can see black is trying to close up the position, right? Because the fact that the pieces are more active for white, black is trying to kind of shut that down and just keep the material advantage. So the white activity and attacking here. But then this move I don't like because the fact that white is down material, Giri wants to try and get his pieces more active. And so what he's doing is they're both kind of like shutting down their rook diagonals. And so right now, Van Foreest is pretty much just up a pawn. So now just getting ready to attack. And then he decides to go with this rook e1 move. You might be thinking, oh, well, these rooks can't capture. Then on his next move, you can see here, he's threatening f5 and trying to open up this file, attack this pawn, all that stuff. And yeah, Van Foreest is also maybe looking at a sacrifice because this bishop is very solid with the same colored pawns. So yeah, just kind of a waiting move, maybe looking at this and just trying to keep all the pawns on light squares here, which is definitely good because Guri's bishop is on dark squares and his bishop is on white squares, so then they can defend each other but can't be attacked. And then now the kings just kind of get into the game. You know, just pushing the kingside pawns. He goes with h3 preparing g4, which Giri does play. And then takes. You can see this king is kind of in a weird spot. But, I mean, he can always run back. Or maybe even f3 this. But he does want to keep this pawn chain, remember. Because these rooks are ready to play this and maybe even that too. Which will also get a tempo on the king. So now, he offers a trade of rooks. Giri does not want one. He offers another trade. Doesn't want one. But then finally, Giri relents. He's like, well, you know what? I want to go for the win. And so he decides to trade off and go for it. However, the engine eval shows that white is a little bit worse off. So I think Giri would have gone for a draw if he had known that. Because the fact that even though he's in active position, he still is down a pawn. So then, Van Foreest goes bishop back, preparing maybe this and then starting to get the rook in here. And then he just goes with kind of a check here. King back, and then now he goes after the g7 pawn, which Van Foreest can just push, and then now he's also threatening f6, because if f6 here, the rook has nowhere to go. It's stuck by its own pawns, and then all these pawns defend all these squares here. So then he has to run back, and he still plays f6, but this does weaken this pawn a little bit. And so eventually, he has to sacrifice this pawn, because there really isn't anything better for him. Because if he does this, then here, threatening this, and then if this, same thing, just coming right back. And then if he goes back, then he's this. So, many different things that he has to take into account. And he's like, well, you know what? If I can't improve my position, well, then I might as well just sacrifice the extra pawn that I have, right? So then, you can see, he decides to go here, and then grabs the pawn, and then he gets kind of a tempo with his king f7. So now rook back, and then now he offers a trade, doesn't want one. And then now Van Foreest decides to get his rook active. So threatening the pawn here the king defends it. And then he decides to go with this attacking bishop, which also puts some pressure on that pawn. So here, and then the king has to go back, and then another check. And then here, he's threatening this pawn, but then he has to run his rook first. And then Anish decides to go with kind of an in-between check before defending his pawn again. So then he goes here, and then he decides to push. And then there's this very daring move, which the engine does not like. But positionally, it's very good for black because black has a lot of threats. And so after takes, this actually cuts off the king, and the rook and the bishop are both kind of out of the action because the bishop is actually stopped by the pawn and the rook. And so he takes, and then he starts pushing the pawn. And then you can see here, it's still winning for white because white has check here, and then he just plays this, getting ready to play this and defend this square. So you can see here, then that defends the square with plenty of time. Instead, however, Anish, who is extremely well on time in this game, plays the sensible rook a7, you know, just keeping the king back and getting your rook active, but still, that is just not enough. And after this move, a check, another check, then Anish Giri loses on time. And the championship goes to Jorden Van Foreest, the first time in 36 years a Dutchman has won. They were actually both from the Netherlands, so Netherlands was like ready to win it, but you know, it was just a great battle between those two to decide who the champion would be. So yeah, thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And congratulations to both players for their great performances.